It was a stormy night when Sarah, a 29-year-old woman, moved into her new apartment. The building was old, with creaking floors and a strange atmosphere, but the rent was cheap, and she needed a fresh start. The landlord, Mr. Grayson, handed her the keys and gave her a final warning before leaving. "Mr. Grayson, don't mind the noises. This building has history. Just ignore anything strange, and you'll be fine." Sarah laughed it off, thinking it was just an attempt to scare a newcomer. On her first night, Sarah heard whispers. At first, she thought it was the wind, but as she lay in bed, she heard it again, soft, unintelligible murmurs coming from the walls. She pressed her ear against the wall, holding her breath. "Whisper, help me, I'm trapped." Sarah bolted upright. "Who's there?" she whispered, her heart pounding. Silence. The next morning, she dismissed the incident as a dream, but the whispers returned every night, always at 3 a.m. The apartment had a locked door at the end of the hallway. Mr. Grayson had said it was a storage room, and she shouldn't worry about it. But as the days passed, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that someone was inside. One night, she stood outside the door, pressing her hand against it. The air around it felt cold. Suddenly, she heard a faint knock from the other side. Knock, knock, knock. She stumbled back, her heart racing. "There's someone in there," she whispered to herself. Sarah decided to talk to her neighbor, Mrs. Collins, an elderly woman living next door. "Sarah, have you ever heard noises from the walls?" Mrs. Collins' face darkened. "You shouldn't be asking about that. The last tenant disappeared." Sarah froze. "What do you mean?" Mrs. Collins lowered her voice. "He lived in your apartment. One night, he vanished without a trace. They never found his body." That night, Sarah heard the whispers again. But this time, there was a new sound, a scratching noise, like nails on wood. She got out of bed and followed the sound to the locked room. A piece of paper slid out from under the door. It had a single word on it: "Run." Terrified, Sarah called the landlord. "Sarah, Mr. Grayson, what's in the locked room?" There was a long pause before he replied. "Mr. Grayson, you shouldn't have seen that note. Leave the apartment, now." Sarah hung up, but instead of leaving, she grabbed a hammer and broke the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a dark, empty room. But in the corner, she saw a figure. It was a man, curled up, whispering to himself. His eyes were wide and lifeless. "Man, they won't let me leave. They won't let you leave either." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind her. Days later, a new tenant moved into the apartment. As they unpacked their things, they noticed a piece of paper stuck to the wall. It had a single word on it: "Run." And the whispers began again.
The Curse of the Banyan Tree. Ananya, a 19-year-old college student, had never liked the idea of visiting her grandparents' village in Durgapura, West Bengal. The remote settlement, with its ancient houses and dense forests, felt like stepping into another era. Still, her parents insisted she join them for a short break from city life. After a grueling train ride through fog-covered tracks and fields drenched in silence, she finally arrived. The house itself was old and sprawling, with creaking wooden floors, musty air, and a certain stillness that unnerved her. Her father, while unpacking, mentioned something that caught her attention. "Whatever you do, don't wander near the banyan tree at the edge of the village," he warned. "The locals say it's cursed." "Cursed?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Just old stories. You know how these villages are," he replied. But the way he avoided her gaze made it clear he believed more than he let on. That evening, as she tried to settle in, the whispers of the banyan tree's curse grew louder in her mind. The house offered no distractions, the Wi-Fi was weak, and the television played only static-filled channels. Restless, she sat by the window, gazing out at the village bathed in moonlight. The banyan tree, visible in the distance, stood like a shadowy giant. The longer she stared, the more uneasy she felt. Its twisted roots seemed alive, and its canopy, thick and sprawling, blotted out the stars above it. Later that night, Ananya overheard her grandparents talking in the next room. "She mustn't go near the tree," her grandmother whispered urgently. "It already took Ramesh's boy last month." There's no need for more trouble. Ananya's heart raced. She'd heard similar stories from the villagers earlier. They spoke of a churail, a vengeful spirit said to haunt the banyan tree. Some claimed to hear whispers calling them by name. Others spoke of strange lights at night, and there were stories of people vanishing without a trace, leaving only their footsteps leading to the tree. The next night, Ananya woke suddenly. Her room was dark, but something felt off. She listened closely and realized there was a faint sound, a low, rhythmic chanting. It was coming from outside. Her curiosity overpowered her fear. She slipped out of bed, grabbed her phone and a flashlight, and tiptoed out of the house. The village was eerily silent as she made her way toward the banyan tree. The air grew colder with every step, and a strange mist curled around her feet. She felt as though the shadows themselves were watching her. Finally, she stood before the tree. Its roots jutted out of the ground like skeletal hands, and the carvings on its trunk seemed to glow faintly in the moonlight. Then, she heard it, a voice calling her name. Ananya, come closer. Her blood froze. It wasn't just a voice. It sounded familiar, like someone she knew. Who's there? She called out, her voice trembling. There was no reply. Suddenly, her flashlight flickered and died, plunging her into darkness. Panic set in as she fumbled with her phone, trying to use it as a light. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were almost deafening. She turned to leave, but the path she had come from was gone, swallowed by the mist. Then, from the base of the tree, a figure began to emerge. At first, it looked like a woman, but as it stepped closer, Ananya saw its twisted limbs and unnaturally long hair. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its lips curled into a sinister smile. You shouldn't have come here, the figure hissed. Ananya stumbled back, her heart pounding. The figure moved closer, its movements jerky and unnatural. Ananya screamed and turned to run, but she tripped over the tree's massive roots. Just as the figure reached out for her, a voice echoed in her mind, "Run!" She scrambled to her feet and bolted. The whispers followed her, growing louder and more menacing. When she finally reached her grandparents' house, she slammed the door shut and locked it. Her grandmother was waiting for her, her expression grim. "You went to the tree," she said quietly. "It wasn't a question." Ananya nodded, too terrified to speak. Her grandmother sighed and gestured for her to sit by the fire. "The banyan tree is cursed," she began. "Long ago, a young bride was betrayed and murdered there. Her rage and sorrow bound her spirit to the tree. She became a churail, and now she lures people to their doom. Once she knows your name, she doesn't stop." The next few days were a nightmare. The whispers didn't leave Ananya alone. They followed her everywhere. In the house, in her dreams, and even when she closed her eyes. Objects in her room began to move on their own, and her reflection in the mirror twisted into something unrecognizable. One morning, she woke to find muddy footprints leading from her window to her bed. Desperate, Ananya sought the help of the village priest. He listened to her story and nodded gravely. "You've awakened the churail," he said. "She won't stop until she has you. But there's a way to end this. You must confront her at the tree and use this talisman." He handed her a small, intricately carved object and performed a ritual to protect her. That night, Ananya returned to the banyan tree, clutching the talisman tightly. The fog was thicker than ever, and the air felt heavy with malice. As she approached, the whispers turned into screams. The churail appeared, her face contorted with rage. "Why resist?" she hissed. "Join the others." The ground beneath Ananya trembled as skeletal hands erupted from the roots, reaching for her. Mustering all her courage, Ananya held up the talisman. A blinding light erupted, and the Churail let out a piercing scream. Her form dissolved into ash, and the whispers fell silent. When Ananya returned home, the banyan tree was lifeless, its roots withered and blackened. The village seemed lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. But as Ananya prepared to leave, she glanced out the train window. In the distance, she saw a faint figure standing where the tree once stood, a woman with long hair, watching her with glowing eyes.